Hey, gang, this week's episode is brought to you by our pals at NordVPN, celebrating a birthday this month. Hey, get a free gift and a free month when you order a 2-year plan at nordvpn.com/goodseats and use the promo code GOODSEATS. Yes, that's nordvpn.com/goodseats, promo code GOODSEATS for your free month and free gift when you order a 2-year plan. Now, here's our show.
Your narrator is Oscar Reichel. This is the home territory of the Pacific Coast League. From Seattle to San Diego, more than 1,700 miles apart, our splendid teams play, taking in Portland, Sacramento, Oakland, San Francisco, with Hollywood and Los Angeles in between. In the top leagues of the East, the American and National, the longest distance is some 900 miles between Boston and Chicago. But our great League of the West regards such spaces as but normal. And to reach the 18 million people in our territory, long jumps from city to city are commonplace. Like the Pacific Ocean, we too stretch along and connect the cities of the entire coast. For 43 years, the Pacific Coast League has been flourishing in this territory. Its president, a gentleman famed in the national baseball world, Clarence Rowland, will tell you more.
Baseball fans, I am pleased to present to you, through the medium of this film, an inside picture of our Pacific Coast League. We are now in our most important season, for this is the year in which we have declared our intention to become a major league. And this is the year in which we shall seriously go about proving our point. In this great Pacific area where we play, we have approximately 15 million people, more than enough to bring our league up to the peak in baseball. You will no doubt be familiar with many of the names and faces of the players in this film of our spring training. For those who have not achieved great fame, are on the verge of it. The 1946 season is here, and our clubs are giving you the best in baseball.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hooray for Hollywood. Oh, hi there, friends. It's your pal, Tim Hanlon. How you doing? It's Good Seats Still Available. Yes, the curious little podcast that is devoted to, of course, what used to be in professional sports. How you doing? Thanks for coming by and downloading us, putting us in your earbuds, etc. You caught me in a little bit of a Hollywood moment. Yes, Hollywood, California, home of the stars. And in this case, in particular, specifically, the Hollywood Stars. Yes, the team from the Pacific Coast League, which is our topic this week with our guest, Dan Taylor. He, the author of the great new book from Rowman and Littlefield called Lights, Camera, Fastball, How the Hollywood Stars Changed Baseball. And like the name implies, the stars of Hollywood were backed by a cavalcade of performing stars, as they were, the investor group behind this team. But we get into all the various facets of the time, the era, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, well, not 60s, well, yeah, early 60s, because obviously the Major League Baseball finally discovered Los Angeles and the West Coast and San Francisco and kind of put a dent in the Pacific Coast League. But before the Dodgers and the Giants kind of began this discovery, shall we say, of California in the major leagues, the Pacific Coast League was the thing. And as you heard in that clip there, the season preview of the 1946 Pacific Coast League season, there was an ambition to perhaps make the PCL not sort of just the top tier in the minors, but literally to make that jump into major league status. And we'll get into that part of the dialogue with Dan in a couple of minutes in our conversation. But you got to remember that prior to the late 1950s, when the Dodgers and Giants bolted westward for the Golden State, you had top tier professional baseball in the forms of the San Francisco Seals, the Oakland Oaks, the aforementioned Hollywood Stars, the Los Angeles Angels, their crosstown rival. Yes, that was the name of the team. And this is obviously a predecessor of what became the American League expansion franchise known as the California Angels, the Anaheim Angels, and now the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim. Yes, that's where the original name Los Angeles Angels came from, was this team in the Pacific Coast League. The Sacramento Salons, San Diego Padres, yes, that was their name prior to the Major League Padres expanding in the late 60s. The Portland Beavers and the Seattle Reniers. And there were a couple of other fits and starts of other teams in the PCL. But those were kind of the major ones that stuck around for the longest period of time. And again, this was top tier major league, if you will, not in name, of course, baseball on the West Coast as it was growing into its own. Millions of consumers of baseball and high quality play at that, for sure. But we're going to get into the specific story of one of those teams of the PCL, the Hollywood Stars. And yeah, as we get into our conversation with Dan Taylor in a few moments' time, there were actually two officially incarnations of the Hollywood Stars. There was a version from 1926 to 35, which was the original incarnation of the Sacramento Salons, which was a charter member of the PCL. We tip our cap to that a little bit, but the main thrust of our conversation and this great book is the 1938 to 1957 version of the Hollywood Stars, which actually got their start as the Vernon Tigers. They became the Mission Reds, and then frankly just became ultimately the we're part of the sort of San Francisco phenomenon. They were the rivals of the San Francisco Seals for a long time, and then they essentially moved in 1938 to become once again the Hollywood Stars after the first version decamped for San Diego. So there's a lot of intrigue here, but the Pacific Coast League is the background of this story. And for those who grew up at the time, would remember and would fight you on just how high quality the play was and the memories. This was essentially Major League Baseball, again, short of the name, for everybody concerned up and down the West Coast of the United States. And again, in Los Angeles, the rivalry between the Stars and the PCL version of the Los Angeles Angels was as heated as you would find anywhere in not just in baseball, but in sports generally. In LA, these were out and out derbies, right? Between two of the often title contenders, but certainly the most visceral rivalry you would find in the PCL. And in the most major of markets of the Pacific Coast League, you had Los Angeles, which was essentially becoming, in its own right, I guess the third largest media market, and then soon to eclipse Chicago over time. So you had, plus obviously, the center of all things entertainment, film studios and a budding and robust television industry. So the Hollywood Stars and the Angels, the Los Angeles Angels, were on television and radio regularly. I mean, these were top tier media offerings, and the games were broadcast live in the Southland. Now, it's ironic because we searched long and hard to find, at least on YouTube and in sort of the generally available internet clips, to find some game footage, and alas, it eluded us. We'll get into some of the reasons, perhaps, as to why those clips of those games are not readily available or easily found. But we'll get into it. But Dan and I pretty much are of the belief that there is absolutely footage and audio of a bunch of those games, especially the derbies between these two teams in LA, to be found and to be had. And yes, did it overlap these games with the Hollywood investor base that was to be found in both of these ownership groups, in particular the Stars? You bet there were, ample opportunities for the players to make cameos and make a little extra coin, either trying to replicate their baseball exploits for film and or side jobs in the television industry for sure. And look, the ownership of this Hollywood Stars franchise reads like a who's who of celebrities of the time. Lloyd Bacon and Gary Cooper, William Powell, George Raft was amongst the ownership group. George Burns and Gracie Allen, Bing Crosby, Cecil B. DeMille, the great William Frawley, yes, of I Love Lucy fame, as Fred Mertz, of course, part of the mix. All kinds. Gene Autry, who ultimately became the owner of the then soon-to-be expansion franchise that became the Los Angeles Angels of Major League Baseball. Barbara Stan. I mean, we're talking like the who's who, if you will, of Hollywood stars, literally and figuratively. And even the owner, the main owner of the team, had his own sort of fame, if you will. Robert Cobb, one of the major majority owners of this Hollywood Stars franchise, he was the owner of, wait for it, the Brown Derby restaurants, very famous at the time and still legendary. And yes, that last name, Cobb, might ring a bell. That's the guy who the Cobb salad was named after. So this is a team, the Hollywood Stars, that is just full of all kinds of tangents in and around entertainment and all kinds of stuff related to that. And we get into all of that. It's a great chat. And again, this book is fantastic. It's called, again, Lights, Camera, Fastball. And the author of it is our guest this week. His name is Dan Taylor, and that conversation is coming up in a few moments' time. So let us waste not much more time. Let's get a promo out there, shall we? How about, let's flip the cards this week and let's go to, how about Streaker Sports? Sure, why not? StreakerSports.com, the purveyors of sports culture. Of course, they can be found at StreakerSports.com, and the promo code is GOODSEATS for 15% off all of your purchases. What is Streaker Sports? Well, as the name implies, it's a hefty dollop of teams and leagues, franchises no longer around, either previously domiciled or defunct, stuff that we love to roll around in on this show. You name the league, you name the team, chances are really good that StreakerSports.com will have either a shirt or some other form of garb to commemorate said franchise or league. But also great stuff, too, in terms of pop culture. If you've been watching any of the hoops this week, Billy Raftery, one of our great college basketball announcers, the Onions collection is available for you there, and all kinds of other great stuff. You're a fan of Slapshot, some great stuff there. You're a fan of Caddyshack, some great stuff there. All kinds of great stuff. Go there early and often. You'll find some wonderful stuff. And again, it's Streaker Sports, StreakerSports.com. Promo code GOODSEATS, 15% off all of your great purchases. And we thank Streaker Sports, as well as all of our great sponsors, for their support of our little showgram. And let's, again, not waste any more time. Let's dig deep, shall we, into the story of the Pacific Coast League, and in particular, the Hollywood Stars. Here's our conversation with Dan Taylor that we had just a couple of weeks back. As always, please sit back and enjoy. Well, why don't you give our audience a little bit of the Dan Taylor story first, because that'll maybe help give us a little bit of a sense of sort of your adjunct into the story at hand, that being of the Hollywood Stars and the intrigue and the reason behind the book in the first place, if you don't mind.
Well, my background, I spent 30 years as a television sportscaster out here in Fresno, lately working in corporate PR for a large fitness equipment manufacturer, and keep my fingers in the media doing some of the television for our local minor league ball club. That kind of traces back to my start in media work, was actually being the PA announcer in the minor league park here in town when I was a high school senior. And a few years ago, I was approached and really had the good fortune to be asked to collaborate with the legendary scout George Genovese to write his autobiography, A Scout's Report. George is an amazing guy, probably the greatest scout in baseball history. And what was really interesting is our many, many conversations. We became great friends, and the time we spent together, and times at Dodger Stadium. George loved to reminisce about the 2 seasons he played with the Hollywood Stars, and he could, beyond just reminiscing, he would actually draw connections to things that we were seeing in the stadium, uh, to their origins being with the Hollywood Stars. And I had never heard these things before. I thought it was quite remarkable, and really struck me that this ball club was a very, very innovative club. And one of George's closest friends, a fellow by the name of Artie Harris, who was one of the scouts in the movie Moneyball, grew up in the shadow of the Stars ballpark, Gilmore Field. And he filled me with a lot of stories, and made a lot of introductions, and brought a lot of context to information and stories that I was hearing. And the next thing I know, the sleeves were rolled up, and contracts were signed, and I was working away on this book.
What did you think you knew about this team? Because I think the name, even for the casual sports fan, probably is known, especially amongst a certain generation, right? Just for the fact that at least the second incarnation, and we'll get into the wrinkle of that in a minute too, obviously was the side show for Who's Who of Hollywood Stars at the time, right? So I think there's sort of this just general, and the name, right, just kind of flows neatly off the tongue, right? I think people kind of maybe even hazily just say, "Oh yeah, baseball team." I think I remember hearing something along the lines about that. What did you know about it aside from the sort of inkling that you were getting from your pal at the ballpark?
Well, before George started sharing all this with me, I, like so many people who love the game of baseball, associated the Hollywood Stars, as you allude to, with the movie stars. And they were the team in the movie stars. But I honestly didn't know how deep that connection was. I had seen articles over the years, and about all of the movie stars that followed the team, and that on any given night, there would be quite a number of the biggest entertainers in the industry in that ballpark. But I had no idea that there was probably a dozen and a half that were part of the original ownership group. And beyond just turning out for games, they were very involved with the club. I mean, on bat day, you would get Clark Gable and Bing Crosby and Barbara Stanwyck passing out the bats. So, yeah, I knew of the background and the connection with the motion picture industry, but not much else. And that was a real eye opener to learn the things that I learned about them.
Right. So how do you begin this journey then? Because as I alluded to, there are kind of two, if you will, versions of the Hollywood Stars, with a couple of years in the 30s in between them, but they couldn't be more diametrically different. And by the way, their histories are also officially kind of different as well. Do you even consider sort of the first incarnation of the Stars? Do you go back to the Pacific Coast League and its origins? How do you kind of frame this, or do you kind of just keep this sort of with the, shall we call them, the later / more modern and sexier star driven version of the Stars?
Well, I certainly delve into the history of the original, the Bill Lane-owned Hollywood Stars, who moved out from Salt Lake City in 1925. I don't get too into it because you're right; they were completely different operations, and it was really the second incarnation of the Hollywood Stars, the Bob Cobb-driven Hollywood Stars, that were the innovators, and that's really the emphasis. It's telling their story, but really trying to bring to light their innovations. And I go back to the origins of that particular franchise, which were in the Los Angeles area. In about 1910, they were originally known as the Vernon Tigers, which was a small industrial area, a lot the meatpacking district, if you will, of Los Angeles. And then they moved to San Francisco. And in San Francisco, they were always second fiddle to the Seals. They were the Mission Bells, the Mission Reds. They changed their name 2 or 3 times up there, and then never really got any traction in San Francisco. And then in 1938 came to Los Angeles. The Angels let them move in on the provision that they were going to get their own park built, and then they went broke. Their owner was a banker in San Francisco, and he lost some major lawsuits to his investors and had to liquidate. And so it was when Bob Cobb came in and bought that club with the Celebrity Investment Group in November of 1939. That's really when all the innovation and the the flair, the creativity all began. But to your point, yes, they were very different franchises. The original, the ones owned by Bill Lane, they shared Wrigley Field in Los Angeles with the LA Angels, and kind of a bland club that didn't have that celebrity following at all.
No, but the name obviously very alluring, even if they were sort of bereft of the actual their actual namesake per se. So, but it's interesting. Let's talk about the original Los Angeles Angels for a second, which is obviously more related, I guess, to the first version, just for a second, because I think people also in San Diego may sort of say, "Wait a minute, didn't the Hollywood Stars become the PCL version of the San Diego Padres?" The answer to that is yes. And that namesake then actually transferred once the Padres actually got a Major League Baseball expansion franchise in, what was it, 68 or so. So there's a lot of sort of name sort of overlays and confusion and stuff. But the LA Angels, both of the first version of this Stars franchise and, as we'll get into more detail, the second version, do kind of play an outsized role in this because, as you're hinting, right, that first sort of incarnation was a shared Wrigley Field LA experience. But here, the idea of an LA, again, based franchise coming back seems to be predicated on a separate situation, a separate stadium. Does that maybe have some impact in the first year or two, and it's, shall we say, less than stellar comeback to the Los Angeles area, as you're hinting at? Was the stadium the issue or an issue, the fact that maybe it wasn't stable, or was that just part of other things that were not sort of palatable for the franchise to kind of succeed immediately upon return?
There were a couple of issues. One, certainly the stadium. I think the Wrigleys, who owned and operated the Angels as they did the Cubs, the parent team, they grew tired of Lane and company year after year, indicating that they were close on a stadium, and nothing ever came of it. And they finally grew tired of it. They were letting them play in their park, letting that version of the Hollywood Stars play in their park for minimal rent. It wasn't much at all. And ultimately, they hit him with the plan that they were going to really jack up his rent to continue playing in Wrigley. And it infuriated Lane. He looked around Southern California to see what else he could do. And Wrigley's the guy that Wrigley had running the club mocked them and suggested that they just go play at Sawtelle Field, that's currently where UCLA plays their games in the Veterans Complex. And Lane took great offense to that, and then went down to San Diego and met with city leaders in San Diego. And it was a wide open market in a growing city, and struck a deal and moved down there, and it certainly got the ball rolling to great baseball enthusiasm in San Diego. It was a terrific baseball town, and ultimately got them into the major leagues. But yeah, the stadium situation was I think the frustration that the Angels felt. The Angels had to sign off on allowing a second team in their territory, and they were telling the Pacific Coast League that they were getting more and more frustrated with that version of the Stars. And then when they jacked up the rent, that was kind of the last straw, and ultimately Lane went ahead and moved.
All right, two questions there that maybe you can help elucidate a little bit further. So number one is the idea of coming back to Los Angeles and being the second team in this market after essentially not succeeding as the quote-unquote second team in the San Francisco market. And then number two, and related, I guess, is this Pacific Coast League altogether. I think it's lost on at least two generations of baseball fans that, this is pre-Dodgers and Giants moving to the West Coast in Major League Baseball. And for many years, right, this was a very thriving league that was on occasion, maybe even more on an occasion, more than capable of pulling its own weight in terms of talent and play, if you will, outside sort of the supposed major, the regional league, if you will, leagues of the East and Midwest.
Well, let me touch first on Hollywood, and then I want to expand on the Pacific Coast League, because you've raised a great topic and a great point. I think as you look back on it, it was a little crazy of Herbert Fleischhacker to bring his team to Los Angeles. I mean, his second team had already failed in Los Angeles. He was failing in San Francisco, but he had to get out of there. It just wasn't working for him. He did have some business holdings in Los Angeles, had an attorney in Los Angeles, and felt that he could get something going down there. But he was really an absentee owner, and I'll share with you how bad it was for that club. There was a point late in the season where the equipment trunk somehow didn't get loaded on the train. They didn't make it to the next city in time for the first game of a series. and that version of the Stars had to forfeit the game. And the Coast League hierarchy, they were furious about it, and they fined the club. And Fleischhacker had to sell a ball player. They had to sell a player's contract in order to raise the money to be able to pay the fine to the Pacific Coast League. That's how bad it was. They just weren't drawing at all. And so clearly, it did fail. And then that's when Bob Cobb came in with his group, and they were able to get it for a discounted price. Fleischhacker wanted $100,000, and they got it for $40,000. As to the Pacific Coast League, this was a great league. I've talked to so many people in the research for this project that grew up during that era, during particularly the latter few years of the glory years of the Coast League, which runs up to 57 before the Giants and Dodgers came west. And it really, to baseball fans, it was their major league. You didn't have television. You didn't have big league clubs coming out. Occasionally, you might get a club coming out for spring training and playing some games. There were a few teams that trained in Southern California and in Arizona and would come through for exhibition games. But throughout the bulk of the baseball season, the Pacific Coast League, for people in California, Oregon, and Washington, that was their major league. And it was very close in talent level to the big leagues. The rosters were made up of players that were just one step away from moving into the big leagues. Guys like Gus Zernial with Hollywood for a time, Bill Mazeroski in 56 for Hollywood, and a lot of guys that were they just finished up. They lost a step in the big leagues, and they were continuing their career, but they didn't have it to continue their career at the big league level. And they played very well and were fan favorites in the Coast League. So coming after World War II in 46, the Coast League made several attempts to try and gain major league status. They wanted to become the third major league. And at one point, after Happy Chandler was out as commissioner and Ford Frick came in, Frick finally developed criteria that the Pacific Coast League would have to meet in order to gain big league status. And he said, we're not going to expand the major leagues by one or two teams. We're going to expand it by an entire league if we expand at all. And the big drawback for the Coast League was the quality of their ballparks. In Los Angeles, you had the Angels Park, Wrigley Field. That did meet major league standards. That was the only one. And that was kind of where the quest for the major leagues ended.
That's interesting because also around the time, like certainly 1960 or so, in the years a little bit prior, the discussion around the Continental League, right, which we've talked about in a couple of different other episodes, right, the idea of maybe that being the third professional league, although not necessarily blessed by anyone in Major League Baseball. But frankly, all fits and starts around, a growing country, right? Certainly in the 1950s with a booming economy and then the war being over and leisure time growing and disposable income, all that kind of stuff, right? And why not pro sports, perhaps looking beyond, shall we say, than the Midwest and the East Coast roots that, for all the major sports for that matter, but baseball in the vanguard, frankly, kind of maybe pushing it. But, in retrospect, right, you look at San Francisco and Los Angeles just as obvious colonizations, shall we say, right now. Having grown up in New York with generations of baseball fans, it's hard to be objective about that, right? But it certainly, I think what, in not so many words, right, the PCL, certainly in those markets and others over time later on, right, really softened the ground to make this a relatively straightforward and a booming baseball business environment in both of those markets relatively quickly.
Well, beginning in 1941, you had the St. Louis Browns seriously looking at moving into Los Angeles. And the story that has been out there for years is that the meeting was to take place to vote on the Browns' move on December 8th or 9th, 1941. And we all know what happened on December 7th, 1941. And the move was rejected. But in researching that, in reality, it had no chance to pass because they would have been the lone team west of St. Louis, and travel would have just been very difficult. The plan they proposed was that a team would play in Chicago, finish up on a Sunday afternoon, get on a train, which at that time took a day and a half, and then you would play Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in Los Angeles, get back on a train, and go back to Chicago, and start another series there again. And it just wasn't feasible. It was really after the war when airplane travel, which Hollywood was actually the first team to travel by plane, but as they softened their stance, because the American and National League presidents did not want their teams traveling by plane. They were really nervous about the idea of a disaster wiping out an entire ball club. So once they became more comfortable with air travel, they softened their stance on Los Angeles as a destination for a big league club. And Bill Veeck in '52 began looking at Los Angeles as a potential home for the Browns. But at the same time, they wanted a second club. They wanted a club in San Francisco so you'd have a travel partner and you'd come out here for a week or longer to play in those two cities. And it was always a stumbling block as far as coming out. But after the war, California exploded in terms of population and opportunities, and when the Rams came out in '46 and you had professional football in Los Angeles, you knew that it was just inevitable that baseball was going to follow soon.
All right. Well, speaking of brown, let's talk about that color as it relates to one of the owners, Robert Cobb, right? Owner of the Brown Derby, the very famous Brown Derby restaurants. He's a restaurateur. How does that qualify him to be a baseball owner? But I'm going to guess that has something to do with the allure that those restaurants, or the main ones, certainly had amongst the sort of Hollywood set.
Exactly. He started as an employee at the original, moved up to general manager, and ultimately took over ownership of the Brown Derby. There were 4 Brown Derbies in its heyday. The principal one, the most celebrated one, was at Hollywood and Vine, just down the street from all the studios. So all the radio and movie stars would come in there for lunch. And he built a second one near Beverly Hills that was to cater to the celebrities that lived there and wanted a place close to home to go for an upscale dinner. And then he had the original, which was the small restaurant in the hat formation, and that actually, as part of the will of his partner, when his partner passed, that went to the daughter. And then he had a third one, or a fourth one, I should say. There was a 4th Brown Derby. He was a sportsman. He was an avid sportsman. He was born in Missouri, grew up in Billings, Montana. And his mother ran a Native American Indian team up there. She owned a boarding house. His father was in law enforcement. And he was just an avid sportsman. He loved playing ball. He loved hunting. He loved getting out and roping. And was later a very avid participant in national skeet and trap shooting competition. He would break away from his role at the Brown Derby and get together with Clark Gable and Harpo Marx. They would go to a ranch and they would rope cattle. But he loved baseball. He was an avid baseball fan. And in that November 1938, his attorney approached him and said, "I've got this opportunity, and I think you'd love it." And they discussed it, and he got on the phone, and the first call he made was to Cecil B. DeMille, the legendary director, who said yes, and then Bing Crosby and Barbara Stanwyck, her husband Robert Taylor, and then on and on and on. It snowballed, and he had about almost 20 of the biggest names in Hollywood all signed up to join him in an ownership group to take over this Pacific Coast League Ball Club.
What's the pitch, literally, in terms of becoming that? Because from what I read or what I understand is it was any of those names probably, or a good bunch of them, could have been the sole or major owner by themselves. But it almost feels like there was almost a bending over backwards to kind of make it more of a spread the wealth and or names attached kind of a approach versus sort of a concentrated ownership.
Well, and I believe Cobb's attorney is the one that came up with the idea, but it was a share offering. It was $7,500 a share, and nobody could own more than one share. And as Cobb was quoted at the time, "We want to do this for the community, and we want to do this for ourselves to have fun. Nobody's going to make any money. Any profit on the team is going to get poured right back into either team improvements or ballpark improvements." And he just pitched it as a community endeavor. And a lot of these folks, Bing Crosby, for instance, Bing Crosby was a huge sportsman. We all know about his golf prowess, but quite a fisherman and part owner of the Pittsburgh Pirates later on. And you're right. There were a number of Louis B. Mayer was floated many, many times as a prospective owner of a big league team. It always seemed that whenever some team was struggling, there was a year the Cardinals were said to be up for sale, and Louis B. Mayer and Babe Ruth, I think, were the two names that came up. We're going to buy it together and move it to Los Angeles, which never happened, of course. But there were a lot of baseball enthusiasts. George Raft, Bill Frawley, Joey Brown. They were huge baseball enthusiasts, and so he just recruited his friends on the idea of let's do something for the community and let's have some fun at the same time.
Yeah, William Frawley. I'd love to see Fred Mertz throwing out the first pitch. Let me. Did you get any sense of all these names, these stars, and/or folks within the Hollywood community, Cecil B. DeMille, about the reasons individually why they thought this was something that they wanted to do? What do you think it was? Were any of them sort of eyeing sort of the PR potential of it, or was it just for the love of the sport, or just some, a charitable thing because they wanted to see the Hollywood community thrive? I mean, I'm sure all of their reasons were different, or maybe they weren't.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. I know from some of the things that I read, they were baseball fans and they thought it would be a fun thing to do. But beyond that, it's hard to say. I mean, you touched on Bill Frawley. He was a fan to the point where in any contract he signed for any show or motion picture he did, there would always be a clause that he insisted upon that he couldn't be made to work if the Yankees were in the World Series, because he was going to go to the games. The Stars turned to him and to George Raft at points when they were struggling to find ball players and asked if they could call their contacts. Raft was particularly close with people with the Dodgers, and Frawley was extremely close with people with the Yankees. And so people who were huge baseball fans seemed to be the original focus. Barbara Stanwyck and her husband Robert Taylor, I don't know what drew them to it. I think she was a friend of Cobb's wife at the time, the actress Gail Patrick. But other than them being great fans, good question.
Well, I guess Cobb and Collins, his attorney, were thinking that at the very least this was going to be an obvious PR machine, right? Because to have all of these stars or folks related to them in the mix and having even a nominal ownership, right? Just the fact that if they even show up at a game, it becomes kind of a cause celeb, right? So there's also so much ancillary attention, let alone the actual play and the sports casting / reporting. I got to think that was just a unmatchable promotional platform that any other team could ever hope to match.
Absolutely, but I think even more importantly, it was instant credibility for a ball club that had a bad name in town. And I think when you look at the struggles that the Stars had gone through in '38, and then you look at their predecessors as Hollywood Stars packing up and leaving town, I think bringing these key people, these key names who were just icons in the community, bringing them together, brought instant credibility to the team, and the fact that they put it together in a day. I mean, this wasn't an arduous several month process to try to pull these 20 investors together. Cobb got on the phone, and instantly DeMille was his first call, and he said yes. And it was like that. It was a day and a half to put this all together, and then the stadium deal came together just within hours. It was a very quick deal that they put together, and I think you add that to the second player that they purchased being Babe Herman, who was a legend in Southern California. He was from Glendale, had been a high school sensation, and obviously a huge star in the big leagues with the Dodgers and the Reds. I think Babe Herman brought the team instant credibility in terms of the on-the-field product. So they did it right. There was no question bringing these people together and then adding Babe Herman in terms of the roster. It cemented this team as something legitimate in Southern California.
All right, well, we'll get into some of the sort of the doings and the sort of day-to-day sort of game environment and what it was like and stuff. But I think it's premature before we sort of talk about a little bit about the stadium itself. Now, we talked about the first year was a sort of a shotgun wedding, I guess, of sharing Wrigley Field with the Angels once again in this, if you will, of the second incarnation Maybe a little bit of a background about Gilmore Field, because without it, right, this was not going to sort of last too long, this franchise. So I'm wondering how hastily considered or built or envisioned all of this was. And for those who are not familiar with the Los Angeles area, this stadium sat on what is now CBS's Television City. And there's obviously a story as to all that, but a little bit about the field and how that sort of came to be, because it sounded like they needed to get something quick.
Well, they did, but Victor Ford Collins, who was Cobb's attorney, had an idea, and I'm not so sure they hadn't approached Earl Gilmore with this prior. But Gilmore didn't want to do it, at least not with the previous Hollywood Stars group. But they raised $200,000 from their share offering. $40,000 went to buy the ball club. $50,000 was set aside to improve the roster, and then $100,000 was set aside for their half of the cost to build Gilmore Field. Earl Gilmore was an oil man. He had the largest chain of gas stations in the West, Gilmore Oil. He was a big sportsman, very involved with Hollywood Park Racetrack. He sponsored cars in the Indy 500, airplane races. Loved his sports, avid golfer. And he had a large plot of land in what's the Fairfax district of Los Angeles. I believe it was 22 oil wells on the land. And he had built a 20,000-seat football stadium where some of the colleges and high schools played, and they had midget auto racing in there on Tuesday nights. And then Cobb and his attorney, Victor Ford Collins, proposed just a short distance away from the football stadium that they construct a baseball stadium on, I believe, 12 acres of Gilmore's property. And just across the street is the Farmers Market, which is still there today, a great destination in Southern California. And they set out, they got it done fast. Gilmore oversaw the construction. He was a real tough negotiator. He wanted a percentage of every ticket sold, percentage of all the fence advertising, and he wanted his name on the stadium. And they came up with the plan. They built it entirely from wood because Cobb had visited Wrigley Field a lot, which was a big concrete stadium. It's almost an exact replica of Chicago's Wrigley Field. And Bob Cobb felt that it got cold at night, and he didn't want to subject the fans to that. So he wanted Gilmore Field to be primarily wood. And they got it done fast. They convinced the Pacific Coast League to let them open up in the Angels Park as the visiting team for the first series. And remember, Pacific Coast League series back then, their schedule, you played a team for a week. Monday was always the off day. It was the travel day. And then Tuesday through Sunday, you got 7 games in 6 days. Sunday was always a doubleheader. So they played their first series that first week against the Angels in Wrigley. And then they went on the road, and they had a series in Gilmore Stadium, in the football stadium, and they configured that. It wasn't ideal, but they configured that and got a series in there. So it was in early May when they finally got the stadium constructed. They got it done in 5 months, a little over 5 months, and early May they were able to have their first game in Gilmore Field, and it was constructed very uniquely. I think to the first glance, it would look like really any minor league ballpark. A bit of a roof on top, press box, box seats, and then grandstands. And then they added some bleachers between the end of the grandstands and then the foul poles in the 2 corners. Seated 10,000. But Cobb knew from the restaurant business and his dealings with celebrities that celebrities were not going to complain if they weren't happy. They simply wouldn't come back. And he wanted this thing to be right for celebrities. So the boxes were constructed like those at the Hollywood Park Racetrack and also the Hollywood Bowl Entertainment Complex. They had backing, they had siding, a little bit of privacy, but a little bit more upscale than what you would see at a ballpark. And then within the stadium, they put a VIP lounge in. I mean, we're talking decades before the Lakers and their Showtime VIP lounge in the old Forum. And in that VIP lounge, they had a live band before night games, they had a buffet meal for the celebrities. They had an open bar for the celebrities, and so Cobb was a stickler for cleanliness and quality. He employed a team that went through the stadium throughout the game, cleaning up wrappers and cigarette butts and whatnot. And I've often wondered, because Walt Disney was an original box seat purchaser, and I've often wondered if that may have been the motivator for him to employ a practice similar to that in his theme parks. But people have said, that Wrigley was a big 25,000 seat ballpark, comparable to the Chicago Park. But they've said that even though Gilmore was much smaller, it had flavor, it had character. Very, very different, but a unique ballpark.
All right, what's this? NordVPN. Welcome back, NordVPN, and happy birthday to you while we're at it. It is absolutely essential these days as you're traveling, whether it's down the street, down the road, or maybe even across the globe, if and when that occurs again. Wherever you're traveling and you have laptop or mobile device in hand, it is absolutely crucial that you have the protection that a virtual private network affords you, so that you can ensure that when you're logging in and checking your email or whatever at a Starbucks or in a hotel lobby or hell, your friend's house or wherever, that your data is not stolen or compromised. And it is easy to do these days. And the benefits of a VPN are numerous for sure. And NordVPN is absolutely, without question in my mind, the best virtual private network offering that's out there. And to celebrate NordVPN's birthday, they and we have a special offer for you. You order a 2-year plan from NordVPN at nordvpn.com/goodseats and using the promo code GOODSEATS, you're going to get a free extra month just for doing so, as well as a free gift. Now, I don't know what that free gift is. I'm assuming it's going to be good. And I will tell you that the service that NordVPN offers is absolutely tremendous. They've got super fast servers, I think over 5,000 of them now in nearly 60 countries. You want to access your Netflix and favorite entertainment websites from abroad or elsewhere with the protection to make sure that your user information is not stolen. VPNs are going to help, and NordVPN's the best way to do it. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee. If you're traveling at an airport or a coffee shop, it's tremendous protection. It is probably the fastest connection that I've seen of any of the VPNs that are out there. And I will tell you, it's basically flawless. They've got servers in Europe, in Africa, in South America, in Canada, all over the place, 24/7 customer support. You can load up to 6 simultaneous connections, and it's double data encrypted for increased anonymity. And it works on all the platforms, whether it's Windows, Mac OS, Linux, iOS, Android, you name it. It's got just about everything you would ever want and then some in the realm of a virtual private network. That's NordVPN. And again, make sure you use our promo code when you go to nordvpn.com/goodseats and use the promo code GOODSEATS, and you will get, for their birthday greetings, a free month of service when you order a 2-year plan and a free birthday gift. Again, nordvpn.com/goodseats, promo code GOODSEATS. Thank you to NordVPN, and happiest and healthiest of birthdays to you. And now, back to our show. What was the rivalry between the Angels and the Stars, right? Because it seems like it was just natural for friction, shall we say. And not intense. A friendly aversion. Yeah, okay.
It was intense. I've talked to guys who played for either of the teams and also played for either the Giants or Dodgers in the big leagues. And they said, as intense as the Giant-Dodger rivalry has been historically, it did not compare to the intensity of the Angels-Hollywood Stars rivalry. When they met, there was going to be a brawl. I think the most infamous was in 1955. They had a doubleheader in Gilmore Field, the two teams, and there was a couple of incidents. There was a player spiked at third base that led to a small skirmish. And then a little bit later, Hollywood's top hitter, Frankie Kelleher, they called him Mouse because he was so quiet. He was thrown at and then drilled in the back. And Kelleher simply dropped his bat and walked very calmly toward the mound. And players said they couldn't understand what he was doing. Number one, it was out of character for him to charge the mound. But on the other hand, if you're going to charge the mound, you're going to run after the starting pitcher or the pitcher. And in this case, he walked very calmly to the mound. But when he got to the pitcher, he hauled off and belted him in the chest. And they said the pitcher flew 6 feet back in the air and landed on his keister. And the next thing you knew, there were 40 players fighting on the field. And it raged for so long. It raged for a half hour. And it was such that the chief of police, Chief Parker, had just gotten home from the beach. He turned on his television set and saw this live melee on the field at Gilmore Field. He got on the phone and sent the riot squad out to break it up. And Chuck Stevens, the Stars' first baseman that afternoon, told me that when they finally completed the first game of the doubleheader and they got back into the dugout, or got it back into the clubhouse, I should say. He said there was a guy standing in a suit in front of his locker, and Chuck was pretty frustrated and angry over what had happened, and he barked at the clubhouse guy to kick this fellow out of the clubhouse. And the man turned around, held up his badge, and announced himself as the sheriff of the riots, or the sergeant of the riot squad. And he proceeded to lay down the law that in the second game of the doubleheader, only the 9 players who were in the game were allowed to leave the clubhouse. And if a relief pitcher had to go warm up, he and the catcher could leave, and that was it. Everybody had to stay in if they were out of the ball game. And that was the biggest of the brawls. In their last game ever in 1957, the Angels pitcher was Tommy Lasorda, and he, throughout the game, was throwing at the head of the Stars' second baseman, Spook Jacobs. And it got to a point where Spook Jacobs finally pushed a bunt up the first base line, and Lasorda came over to field it, and he tried to put a football block on Jacobs, and Jacobs tried to put one on him, and the next thing you know, you got 40 players on the field brawling. So Tommy Lasorda, I guess, has a little place in the rivalry history as the guy who instigated the final brawl in the history of the Stars and the Angels. But it was a very, very intense rivalry.
Well, besides scrapping on the field and that rivalry, can you characterize? Was there any characterization of maybe sort of the the persona of the fan base for each of these two teams? Because it would seem to me that the Angels organization would be just kind of frustrated by, if you will, the second interloper now with the same name. Arguably for maybe a territory that they felt was originally and maybe still solidly theirs.
Well, when the Cobb Group bought the club, he hired a guy named Oscar Reichow to be the business manager, to run the general manager, we would probably call it today. He had previously run the Angels and had been let go in kind of an acrimonious situation. And the 38 Hollywood Club had their offices. There was a tower, a tall tower at Wrigley Field on the first base side behind home plate. And the Stars office from the 38 Club was in there. And the minute Cobb hired Oscar Reichow, the Angels kicked him out. They booted him out of that office. And so they actually set up their office temporarily in Gilmore Stadium. But it's very clear from that moment on. In fact, there were a lot of articles and columns written about the ejection from the tower. And it said, one columnist said, the rivalry is on and this is going to get good. And it did. I mean, there was a lot of animosity. Right away, Hollywood went out and they wanted to become very active in player development. They didn't want to continue to buy former big league guys or big league guys that were on the downside of their career. LA had so much talent in their high schools and their colleges. And if you waited until a player got to be a senior in high school, now you're bidding against the big league clubs for him. And that's just a no-win situation for Coast League clubs. They didn't have the financial resources. Well, Hollywood found, Reichow and Cobb found a loophole in the baseball signing rules. The rule everybody followed really only pertained to the big league clubs, the 16 big league clubs. It didn't pertain to the minor league clubs. So they went out and started raiding LA high schools and signing juniors and some really good prospects. I had a great conversation with Clint Hufford, who was one of them. And he said the morning after he signed, a scout for the Yankees and a scout for the Dodgers showed up at his father's gas station and berated them for not waiting. Well, the Angels were so angry with what Hollywood was doing, that they sent their 2 scouts to do assemblies at area high schools to encourage the baseball players not to consider signing with the Hollywood Stars, but to wait and complete their senior season and consider the Angels or big league teams, but ignore Hollywood. So yeah, it was contentious on the field. There was animosity off the field, and when Fleischhacker had brought the club from San Francisco for the 38th season, the Angels gave him a 20-year exclusion. They opened their territory up for 20 years. And as it got into the mid-50s, early in the mid-50s, they started making noise to Cobb that they were not going to renew it. And they wanted him out. And the Coast League knew that Hollywood was a very profitable club. The Stars and the Angels were the 2 best drawing clubs in Southern California, or in the entire league. And so the league wasn't enamored with what the Angels were doing, but they were within their rights to do it. So yeah, there was definitely animosity, but each drew their largest crowds of the year when they played one another in their ballpark.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine that they wouldn't jointly recognize that having an in-town rival was, shall we say, good for business. I guess you just, if I'm the Angels, though, right? You know, this is a team that goes way back to, I guess, the aughts, right? And being somewhat successful in those early years through the teens and the 20s. I'm struck, though, but when I look at the stats here, and again, I'm an armchair historian by definition, right? So plenty of pockmarks and holes in my crack assessment of things. But it does look like, right, that once this rivalry was in place, the Angels looked to be the more dominant and superior team for much of the 30s and 40s, well, the latter part of the 30s and much of the 40s. But the Stars kind of reversed the role pretty much come 1949-50 or so.
Absolutely. And let me backtrack a little bit, how big that Angel-Star rivalry was. I'm trying to remember, either 55 or 56, it was actually the Angels who approached the Coliseum with the idea of moving a Angels-Stars series into the Coliseum. And their business manager at the time projected that they would easily draw 40,000 a game for a 6-game series in there. And ultimately they were not able to pull it off. Yes, the Angels, they were LA's team. There's no question. They were. I talked to so many people who grew up Angel fans, and you know, they can recite to you the starting lineup of various championship teams, and indeed through the 30s, they owned the city. They were huge, great crowds, great success on the field. And in 1949, that's when it all changed. And what changed it was Fred Haney. Haney was a tremendous athlete in Southern California in high school. His brothers had been great college football stars in Southern California. And then Fred went off to play pro ball, played for the Tigers, later managed the St. Louis Browns. And when he came home, when the war broke out, it didn't appear that there was going to be baseball on the radio from a lack of advertising dollars. And so he went to Bing Crosby and others, and they put the money together, and Fred Haney became a broadcaster. He was running a liquor store, among other things that he had business interests in, and he became the broadcaster calling the Angels and the Stars home games. And in 49, the Stars had fired Jimmy Dykes as their manager late in the 48 season, and they developed a really bad reputation for going through managers quickly. Most of their guys would last 2 years, and either they'd get tired, some of the board members, from meddling, or they wouldn't have good success. And for the first 10 years of Bob Cobb's Hollywood Stars, they were a second division club. They had a third and a fourth place finish and were quickly eliminated from the playoffs. But for the most part, they were floundering in the bottom half of the 18 Pacific Coast League.
Was that shortness of patience? I mean, I digress, but because of maybe the convoluted ownership structure, or so many voices and nobody running the ship, so to speak?
Well, I think I think it was too many voices, and many of the columnists up and down the state who covered the Coast League pointed the finger at the business manager, Oscar Reichow, as being the guy who tended to meddle a little bit, being a bit of an amateur manager and maybe making some player moves without consulting the manager, things of that nature. But there were members of the board that clearly they would meet up after games. They'd call board meetings after games and drag the manager in there to account for the moves he made. And managers got frustrated with it. And they didn't open up the purse strings to really help them put good product on the field. And so there was a lot of frustration all the way around. But in 49, one of the board members, George Young, owned a large grocery distributorship, and he became adamant that we're being embarrassed and we're doing it to ourselves, and we need to get the right guy in here to manage, and we need to give him the support, and we need to get out of his way. And he kept pushing for Fred Haney, and Haney's name had come up previously when Jimmy Dykes was hired, and even before that. And both times he had seen how the board operated, and he really didn't want anything to do with it. And but this time in 49, they brought him in, and they had long conversations with him, and he had two demands that kind of put some of the, and Bob Cobb in particular, but some of the other board members off. He wanted full control of the roster, and he wanted a multi-year contract, and they had never done that. They'd only given their managers 1-year contracts, and he wanted a 3-year contract. And other board members kept pushing Cobb on this, and Cobb ended up being kind of the lone voice against him. And it took a little while, and finally Cobb came around, and they hired him. And before he actually accepted the job, after the final offer was put on the table, Haney made a call to Branch Rickey. And Haney needed to have a really good player development arrangement with a big league club. Hollywood had deals with the St. Louis Browns 1 year, maybe another year the Detroit Tigers, maybe another year the Chicago White Sox, and you get maybe 4 or 5 players, and the big league club would get first shot at anybody that you had on your roster that they liked. And it wasn't really helping Hollywood at all. And so Haney insisted that he wanted to total control of the roster. He went to Branch Rickey, and Rickey was open to it. And he said, I want young players. I don't want guys that are at the end of their career that you're going to send to me. I want you to send me young guys, and I want young guys who are fast, who are athletic, who can run, because he wanted to play a speed game. He wanted to bunt. He wanted to hit and run. And Rickey agreed, and Rickey sent him about a dozen players. And that really turned it around. Jim Baxis was a young third baseman, had a breakout year. Irv Noren was sent, and he was a local standout from Pasadena. He had a breakout. He had a tremendous year, and he was the most valuable player in the Coast League. And they got several players. Ed Sauer played right field. Mike Sandlock was a catcher. And they got several pitchers, Art Schalak among them, and really good talent. And that's the year they turned it around, and they won their first pennant in 49. They tapered off late in the 50 season, but came back, got in the playoffs in 51. And from there, they were on a roll. I mean, they won 3 Coast League championships in 5 years. And in one of the other years, they lost in the final. And that's that deal with Branch Rickey and hiring Fred Haney as the manager is what turned it all around.
What was, you alluded to it before, what was the media coverage like? Because I'm getting a sense that L.A., obviously being sort of the cradle of the entertainment world, certainly by that time for sure, was maybe a little bit more advanced, I guess, versus most of the other Pacific Coast League brethren out there, right? In terms of, well, I'm sure radio coverage, but perhaps maybe a little bit more advanced than the other teams' television coverage, right? Because this essentially is, arguably the second or third or fourth largest city in the country at this point, right? Where I'm guessing the intensity of this rivalry, both of these teams had, shall we say, they were more than pulling their weight when it came to media coverage.
Well, Hollywood is the first team in minor league baseball to put their games on television. And then they're the first team outside of the city of New York to put games on television. The Dodgers and Giants each televised a game in September of 1939, and then opening day 1940, March 30th, 1940, Hollywood televised its opening day game, and there were only 300 sets in Los Angeles at that time, and they were on an experimental station, but it really went over well. In the city of Long Beach, 20 miles to the south, somebody put a set in the window of their store, and a big crowd gathered to watch the game, and it spilled out into the street, and they had to bring the police in to break it up and get traffic going again. So Hollywood went on and did a few more games on television that year, and then again in 41. Then television went on a bit of a hiatus throughout the war, but when it came back in 46, baseball really jumped into it, because out on the West Coast, they weren't cabled to New York, and so they had to develop their own programming, and baseball was the perfect fit. And you had at least one of the Pacific Coast League teams home every day except for Monday throughout the season from April through September. So it was good 3.5 hour programming available. Later, San Francisco started doing a few games, but after the war, both Hollywood and the Angels got nice television deals with local stations, and they were at a point where they were televising every single home game. And there was a bit of controversy to it, because visiting teams got a share of the gate, and if there was not a good crowd on a particular night, they would blame it on television and criticize the Stars for doing too much television and robbing them of a share of the money that they should be taking home. And so there were concerns, but Cobb was a guy who felt that television was great advertising, and that television was going to generate new fans, and television was going to expose the Stars to the population and bring fans out. So he had a different opinion than most in the game, who were worried that people would simply stay home and watch the game on television. But in terms of the media beyond television, there were 6 daily newspapers in Los Angeles at that time, and the Stars got tremendous coverage, as did the Angels. I think some of the columnists in the San Francisco and Oakland papers were a little more aggressive in digging up tidbits and, to some extent, negativity about managers and players in the Coast League. But no, in Los Angeles, that was the king of coverage between television and games on radio, and then and I think Cobb preceded the Angels in sending the broadcasters on the road rather than doing a recreation of the away games. The broadcasters would go on the road, and then, of course, all the games on television.
How about the nickname, the Twinks?
Short for the Twinklers.
Okay. Any idea as to how that sort of evolved? Was it a columnist one day kind of thing?
Yeah,
derogatory, or was it
no.
in earnest? And a little background on that.
There were a number of different nicknames that the Stars went by. Twinks seemed to be the one that stuck. It was short for the Twinklers. I'm trying to think of some of the others off the top of my head now, but there were a number of nicknames in the 39 season that columnists were throwing out there, and it seemed like each columnist or beat writer had their own little pet nickname for the team. But the Twinks seemed to stick and be used more than any other. Interesting. What about the players? Let's talk about the Stars, quote unquote, themselves on the field. I think there's you mentioned Tommy Lasorda as an adversary that was certainly memorable in Stars history. How about some of the other players that either stood out in play in the Pacific Coast League, but also maybe some that went on to greater things in the majors as well? Any names that stood out, or that you thought would that you discovered along the way as researching this? Well, really, the first big name they had was Babe Herman, who was a tremendous hitter in the big leagues and maybe one of the most popular Brooklyn Dodgers ever. So signing him at the baseball winter meetings buying him, I should say, in the baseball winter meetings there in December of 38 was huge for that ball club. And he led the Coast League in hitting one year and played with them for 6 seasons. And during the war, went back to Brooklyn when they had the shortage of players. He went back up, and for part of the 45 season was a pinch hitter and got a few games out in the field. But he was just a tremendous, tremendous hitter. Bill Mazeroski would be the lone Hall of Famer from the Bob Cobb Hollywood Stars. He was a Pittsburgh product who played here about the first 3 months of the 1956 season, and then I believe it was in early July when he got the call up. And people I talked to that watched him just said, you knew he was going to be great. He was so incredible with the glove. He was just a tremendous talent. Gus Zernial in 48, they had purchased him out of the Cleveland organization, and he came through with just an enormous power season, and the White Sox bought him, and Gus went on and had a tremendous big league career. Those were some of the bigger names when they were with the Irv Noren, the 49 Coast League MVP, went up to the big leagues in 50 and stayed. He was an outfielder with the Senators briefly and then was traded to the Yankees when Mickey Mantle got hurt, and he played in the big leagues for quite a number of years. So they had quite a roster of guys that went on to the big leagues, but I'd say Zernial and Mazeroski probably two of the most successful of their guys in the big leagues. Of course, they also, in 1957, for about 6 weeks, had the legendary Dick Stewart, Dr. Strangeglove, and they were excited to get him. Pittsburgh sent him there. Of course, the year before, he had hit 66 home runs, and at that time, the Angels' star player was a guy named Steve Bilko. And Steve Bilko was the king of Los Angeles, tremendous home run hitter, and a big drawing card for the Angels. And when the Pirates sent Dick Stewart to Hollywood, they were ecstatic because they thought they had the guy to take on Bilko for the headlines and big box office. And in 55, Jane Mansfield had been Miss Hollywood Stars, and she was around the ball club a bit again in 56 and 57. And she had an encounter with Dick on the field before a game in 57, and she said, "Hey, how come your name is always in the How come your name's always in the newspapers and mine isn't?" And Stewart looked down at her and said, "Because you didn't hit no 66 home runs." But Stewart hit 3, I think, in his first 2 games, and then pitchers figured him out, and he didn't adjust. And by mid-May, he was gone, and nothing but a legend was left behind.
So there was absolutely quality play going on, both in the league, between the two teams, certainly the Stars themselves. But I got to think, too, it must have been a hell of a lot of fun being in and around the organization, because I got to think there was some spillover into movies and television in terms of, filming of stuff, cameo appearances, both either of stars and or players in each other's endeavors. Was there a true Hollywood connection, so to speak?
Absolutely.
I got to imagine.
Absolutely. Some of the stories I can't tell you, but there definitely was.
Which ones can't you tell me?
We'll talk later.
Well, I mean, look, I look, for example, at the cover of the 1957 album, Andre Previn and Russ Freeman.
Yes. Right.
The double play album with the beautiful, we believe, topless, though tastefully done, model wearing, Hollywood, fashionably wearing a Hollywood star's cap. But, I'm sure most of these people are not around anymore. We're certainly interested in any sort of interesting little tidbits.
Well, a couple that shared things with me are still around, and they've made me. All I'll say is there was some teasing going on during games between players and female fans, who were, as one player in particular told me, were the biggest female actresses in Hollywood, and they would or would not wear certain things in order to tease the players. But I'll leave it at that without getting into too much additional detail. There were players
on the diamond. How about that?
There you go. There were players who dated some actresses. There were great friendships. Chuck Stevens shared that Jimmy Stewart sat near first base, and Stewart and his wife often had Chuck and his wife to their home for dinner. Gail Patrick, who was Bob Cobb's first wife, later she was married to the literary agent Cornwell Jackson, and they lived on a huge estate. And on Mondays, they would throw big barbecues and pool parties for the players and their families. Players would golf with Bing Crosby. And yes, this did evolve into motion picture opportunities. And Bill Frawley, who was Fred Mertz on I Love Lucy, as you alluded to earlier, films that he was in, Kill the Umpire being one, he would, if they needed extras, why, he would arrange for Hollywood players to come in and be the extras. The Stratton story. There's a lot of Hollywood players that were the extras. In Pride of the Yankees, the Lou Gehrig biopic, that the long distance hitting scenes were done by Babe Herman, because Gary Cooper just couldn't pull it off. He was not left-handed. He was not tremendously athletic. And they actually pulled Babe Herman of the Hollywood Stars in there, and they had to make them long shots so that people would not quickly recognize it was Babe Herman. But they were in a number of movies, and then there were movies like 7-Eleven Ocean Boulevard, a great crime film that was actually shot in Gilmore Field during a Hollywood Stars game, the Jackie Robinson story that was shot partly in Gilmore Field. So there were a number of Stars players who got bit parts in motion pictures. Irv Noren told me a fun story that they figured out a little bit about how things worked and what they could get away with. And there was a particular game scene that was going to be shot to wrap up filming. It was going to be the last day the players were needed. And this particular scene called for a ball to be hit to Noren in center field and for him to make a throw to third base. And Noren intentionally airmailed the throw way over the head of the third baseman so that they would have to be brought back the next day to shoot the scene again, and all the players would get an additional day's pay. But it was a number of players got great opportunities, and then as television evolved and there were game shows and whatnot, they got opportunities there in the mid to late 50s as well.
I got to think, being a player for the Stars and maybe the Angels as well, short of being in the major leagues, this is probably the best kind of situation you could be in, given all the ancillary benefits that come along with it.
There were, there's stories abound that players, Bilko was one in particular that was making so much with the Angels that he didn't want to go to the big leagues. There were guys that were very, very content and very happy to be in the Pacific Coast League, and particularly to be in Southern California at that time. I know George Genovese, when he was taken in the Rule 5 draft by the Washington Senators, he shared with me that when he went in to negotiate his contract, they offered him $5,000, which at that time was the major league minimum in 1950. And he argued that playing for Hollywood, he had made a bit over $6,000 the year before. And the Senators wouldn't budge. But those guys did well financially, and of course there were a lot of different opportunities. Many of the guys worked in the community and had jobs in the off season there, and it just enhanced the popularity of the clubs. Guys would work in sporting goods stores or would sell cars, and people would come to buy from them specifically. So it was quite a unique environment and a unique, just a unique time in baseball history.
Well, sadly, though, as the 50s rolled on, it all comes to a somewhat crashing halt. Maybe you can kind of give a little bit of, I think most fans kind of know sort of the rest of the story, so to speak. But what's it like in those years just prior to the Dodgers and the Giants dramatically making their move? Was there a sense amongst the Stars and the organization that this wasn't going to last much longer, that MLB would at some point just adjunct at some and make this team and the Pacific Coast League kind of second tier and or banish it, if you will, away from, as the big leagues? How much notice do you think people kind of knew and felt? Did they knew they were on, a short leash, so to speak, or what was sort of the dynamic prior to this move of the big leaguers to the West Coast?
Well, I don't think that the people running clubs in the Coast League ever felt that they were not going to get. I think they remained confident they could get that major league status. I think that they had a lot of confidence. It wasn't shared around them, but Cobb in particular really felt strongly that was going to happen. And I mean, they knew that, he was hedging his bets. He went and bought a piece of a Class C or D club in Phoenix and rebranded it the Phoenix Stars. And part of his motivation was to be able to own the territory. So if they had to relocate the Hollywood Stars, they were going to take them to Phoenix. But at the same time, in 1952, he had been invited by the chief of police to come up into the hills north of downtown Los Angeles to the police academy. And when Cobb met with him up there, he looked around and he was really taken. I mean, he felt that this area, Chavez Ravine, was the ideal place for a ballpark. And he brought a close friend up the next day who agreed. They talked about the area would one day be served by 3 freeways. And Cobb was just convinced he had found the ideal site for a ballpark for the Hollywood stars. And he hired a renowned architect, Styles Clements, and they developed a plan for a stadium. The stadium had, it was decades ahead of anything in baseball. It had a restaurant, it had cocktail lounge, childcare, it had, they called them cabanas, which today we call suites. It was way ahead of the game. And he started pitching it to the city and to the county. Now, the county wanted to give him other land. They tried to direct him elsewhere, and he wasn't interested. But ultimately, the city just felt that the Coast League's plan was not going to fly. And the mayor said as much publicly, that he just wasn't going to put stock in the Coast League's quest. And then when LA did not get the A's, when they were sold instead to the Johnson family in Kansas City, there was a lot of criticism of the city leadership in Los Angeles for not doing more to try and get that team as an LA team. And the mayor had a press conference, and he held up this drawing of a stadium, and he said, I have a plan, and we're going to build a stadium for a big league team in Chavez Ravine. And he had basically taken Cobb's plan. Now in 57, when Walter O'Malley made his fact-finding trip to Los Angeles, he told all the city leaders he was not meeting with any of them until he first met with Bob Cobb. And they met for a couple of hours in Mr. O'Malley's suite at the Stadler Hilton, where Cobb laid out the blueprints and the plans for the ballpark that he and Styles Clements had developed. And O'Malley was really excited about it. And he told the city leaders, this is where I'm going. And some wanted to divert him into Wrigley Field, which just was a non-starter. Others wanted him to make the Coliseum a permanent home, and that just wasn't possible. And he was insistent that he wanted to be in Chavez Ravine, and that's ultimately ended up happening. But there was an inevitability. I mean, even on fans, there were young children. This was their team, and they were really huge fans of the Angels and the Stars, and parents were trying to. I mean, I talked to several who said their parents, maybe in 55 started priming them because they saw teams moving. The Browns had moved to Baltimore. The A's had moved to Kansas City. The Braves had moved to Milwaukee. So you started seeing teams move, and the idea of a big league team moving possibly to Los Angeles was becoming more realistic. And, parents were starting to kind of counsel their kids that, this is great, but you haven't seen anything until you see big league baseball. And so there was an inevitability there, at least in 55, 56, that it was coming. And ultimately, the Angels moved to Spokane, and Hollywood almost stayed. The city of Long Beach had just broken ground on a ballpark, Blair Field, which is still there today. And they made a run at trying to get the Stars to come in there, but they couldn't make it work.
Do you sense from your research that in 57 people knew this was going to end, or was it still like a ton of bricks when?
No, they knew it was. And as I look at it, the history that I had previously read, and then when I really dove into this, I mean, at the end of the 56 season, the Dodgers swapped minor league clubs with the Cubs. So the Cubs had owned, the Wrigleys had owned the LA Angels and Wrigley Field, and the Dodgers owned the Fort Worth Cats and their ballpark. And O'Malley sold the ballpark and then traded the Fort Worth Cats to Wrigley for the LA Angels after the 56 season. And then he, with the money from the sale of the park in Fort Worth, he bought Wrigley Field from Wrigley as well in LA. And so as I look at that, I thought, well, what other reason is there for O'Malley to do this but to gain ownership of the territory? So to me, it was in 56, it was a done deal. They were coming. I don't think there's any two ways about it. So
and I think that's lost on sort of the bigger story. I think everybody understands or has heard various flavors of narrative around how the two New York teams came to conquest the West Coast. But I think embedded in that is probably the lesser discussed story of how essentially Los Angeles's baseball life got completely turned turned around. I mean, you had all this minor league rivalry, right through the 50s. And literally in one season, like 1958, it's all been dropped and it becomes Dodgers, right? And it's almost, literally all that sort of Stars and Angels history just vanishes. It's almost like an abandonment, if you will, let alone the teams themselves.
It was tough for some of the young fans in particular who had their favorite players, had their favorite their favorite habits around the ballpark, may have been members of the Knothole Gang. It was tough on the young fans. Adults, I think there was a lot of enthusiasm that Major League Baseball was finally coming and finally here. But it was very tough, I think, on a lot of people. In terms of the employees of the two clubs, a lot of the Hollywood Stars employees went to work for the Dodgers. Mr. Cobb's secretary became secretary to Buzzy Bavasi, the Dodger general manager. Their concessions coordinator, their box office staff, their ticket sales staff, they all went to work for the Dodgers. And then, 4 years later, when the Angels were granted an expansion franchise in Los Angeles, Gene Autry, who had been an investor in the Hollywood Stars, was the principal owner. And he brought a number of former Hollywood Stars players in, and Fred Haney, the former manager, was hired to be the first general manager of the Angels. So you had a lot of Hollywood Stars people with those two clubs. But to have that tight loyalty to the Angels and the Stars, there were some fans that had a tough time for a while.
Let me give you sort of a wrap-up kind of question here. And we asked this question of a lot of guests, especially for teams that have relocated, but certainly for teams that are no longer around for whatever reason or just previously incarnated and whatnot. And this is a little bit of a wrinkle because these are two, in essence, two versions of a club that were part of a minor league, a top-tier minor league at that. And that's this sort of general question of where, if anywhere, does the, shall we say, official or unofficial memory and or ongoing legacy of this club live? Do the California Angels, the Los Angeles Angels of whatever they're called this minute, or the Dodgers, right? Do either of those two teams legitimately lay any claim to a throwback game or games for the clubs that preceded them, and in particular the Stars, right? Because you're more than subtly hinting that there is sort of almost an unrecognized foundation there around the idea of a stadium where it is in Chavez Ravine, right? Some of the innovations that happen with baseball, especially with broadcasting in Los Angeles, right? Some of these things, were literally pioneered by the Stars and or the Angels. And is there any legitimate right, if you will, to sort of do throwback games and nostalgia and that kind of stuff? Or do you think it's, because obviously now in today's big business of sports, right, there's a lot of money attached to those throwbacks and in some cases, frankly, teams just laying claim where their heritage or even the statistics don't even officially sort of connect. I guess what I'm saying is if I was or still am somehow a fan of the Stars, is there a place where I can be sort of legitimately and humbly in remembrance of such, or is it, would it be a bastardization if the Dodgers were to have a throwback game with Stars uniforms?
Well, I think the fact that there is no recognition of the many, many, many innovations the Hollywood Stars brought to baseball was a huge motivator in my writing this book. There's so many things we see every game in professional baseball that trace to Hollywood: the grooming of the infield in the middle innings, the gourmet foods, the concession stands. I mean, there's so many things. Obviously, the Stars wore shorts; they were the first team to do that. There's so many things that as I learned these things and found that there is absolutely no recognition given to the Hollywood Stars for that, it was a huge motivator for me to write this book. No, the Dodgers and the Angels, no, they never recognize their predecessors in Los Angeles. They do have Hollywood Stars games, but they have nothing to do with the old PCL Hollywood Stars. They are softball games on the field involving celebrities, which the Hollywood Stars did do. But Yeah, there's really no recognition, and I think it would be kind of fun. As you say, they do throwback games, which have been very well received all around the major leagues, and to tap into the old Angels and the old Hollywood stars, and whether it's selling some of their memorabilia or their replica merchandise, or just having a game where the players are wearing those old uniforms, I think it would be a lot of fun, and it would bring back some great memories for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there are the heritages of obviously one was the Angels being an expansion team in Major League Baseball, but the Dodgers and all their Brooklyn glory prior, right? But again, baseball and Los Angeles were synonymous for decades, right, prior to these two teams arriving, and the Stars' story in many respects is evidence of that. It just seems, frankly, a missed opportunity, right? Because well, we see this though all the time. Some of this is just older generations of sports fans kind of just yelling at the sky, right? But it's not like, I guess it's lost on lots of current fans of the sport, which is understandable, I guess. But there is history that happened before all of this, right? The Dodgers didn't magically show up in 1958 for no reason, right? There's a lot of stuff behind the scenes. The Stars were part of that, even though it wasn't sort of mostly known, or it was laying groundwork that just atop which, right? I think O'Malley, just neatly sort of figures out Dodger Stadium without sort of, the story you're talking about the Stars looking at that plot of land years prior, right?
Well, very true. There's so much groundwork that was laid by those two teams for the success of Major League Baseball in Los Angeles. You'd like to see it gain some recognition, but then again, I think when the Dodgers came in, they wanted to create their own brand. Their station they aligned with wanted to continue using the LA Angels broadcaster and instead of Vin Scully, and that was a non-starter with Walter O'Malley. But the Stars broadcaster was Mark Scott, who was later the host of Home Run Derby. He had no role when the Dodgers came out. There were a lot of columnists pushing O'Malley to create a role for Bob Cobb, and that didn't happen. So I think the Dodgers wanted to just be their own brand and not be connected, not like the Padres in San Diego, where they embraced the name of the minor league club, went with a different color scheme, but embraced the minor league name. That wasn't going to happen in Los Angeles. But you'd like to see maybe a game, whether it's some sort of an exhibition game or one game a year, where they would remember their predecessors and the teams that laid the groundwork.
And is there any kind of a plaque or statue or anything around where the old Gilmore Field stood in and around the CBS complex there, or Farmers Market area?
It's in a studio, one of the studios there at CBS Television City. There is a plaque, and it's as close as they could get it to where home plate was with the permission of CBS. Apparently, the exact spot. There's equipment and I'm not sure if it's large cameras or what, but there's equipment that runs right over that spot to such a frequency that they didn't want to put the plaque there, so they put it as close as they possibly could. But yeah, there's a plaque within CBS Television City where home plate once was, and then over at the site there, I think there's this very small park at the site of where Wrigley Field was over on Avalon, and they've got a plaque over there as well.
Interesting. And I guess the last question is, and it's been a while since I've sort of been on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Did they ever maybe memorialize the team on the walk, or was it past tense?
No, not on the walk, but in the Farmers Market, which the Gilmore family still owns. There is a display case with replica uniforms, programs, memorabilia. And then in the company offices, which I think is really cool, in the particularly the marketing department, they've got beautiful frame matted black and white game action photos hanging on the walls there in the office of Hollywood Stars Baseball, which is really fun to see.
All right, there it is. On the next trip to Los Angeles, once we get back on an airplane again, for the proverbial day job, one must go, I do, to CBS Television City and get myself over to find that plaque and some of those other memories what I guess was the former site of the old stadium of the Hollywood Stars, Gilmore Field. I think it's fascinating that was sort of the location and sort of the hub for that team for so many years. And as we alluded to, so many other sort of tangents that we can remember and revel in the Stars story. I think I'll have myself a Cobb salad sometime this week in honor of Robert Howard Cobb, the majority owner of the Stars. And there's also some great footage out there of the old Gilmore Field. There was apparently a show called Rescue 8 back in the day. I want to say it was in the 50s. And there's an episode called The Ferris Wheel. You can find it on YouTube. And there's a storyline in there. It talks about some kind of old amusement park. And the demolition of Gilmore Field was sort of baked into that episode. And like I said, it's on YouTube. The show was called Rescue 8, and the episode is called The Ferris Wheel. And it's really cool because you can see a whole bunch of the facade there of the old Gilmore Field. And Lord knows we'd love to sort of help stir up the pot to see if we can help not only Dan, but just baseball fans everywhere dig up some of the footage of some of these games, especially these derbies between the LA Angels and the Stars in the Pacific Coast League heyday. We know that there was game action out there. It was on television regularly. It was on radio regularly. These were professional, top tier major league broadcasts even before there were major league teams there. So let's get to it, Good Seats Nation, and try to see if we can find some of that footage out there of not only the Stars, but the Angels and maybe some other Pacific Coast League action when they were playing in Los Angeles. The book, in the interim, that we'll have to tide you over, it's called Lights, Camera, Fastball, How the Hollywood Stars Changed Baseball, by our guest again this week, Dan Taylor, and it is published by our pals at Rowman and Littlefield. You can, of course, get it wherever fine books are found. Yes, you can get the Kindle edition, whatever you want to do. And of course, if you'd like to give us a couple of shekels of love for our little efforts, by all means, go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Search up this episode number 208 with Dan Taylor, and you'll find a convenient link to the book and to at Amazon. And of course, you'll get it about as quickly as humanly possible. We thank you for purchasing your media that way, because again, we get a couple of pennies and nickels and dimes, and it helps keep our lights on and our heat on as the springtime hopefully gets here soon in the Chicago area. We appreciate that, of course. If you want to follow us on social media, we'll go right ahead. You can do that. You'll find us on Facebook. There's a page devoted to us. You'll find us on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. You will also find us on Twitter at Good Seats Still. Would you like to send us some email? You could do that too. hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's the way to do that. Let's see what else. You want to get our weekly email newsletter, get a little head start on what the episode topic is going to be for the coming week. Just go to the website and you'll find a little link there. Just give us your name and your email address, and voila, you're in the know and will be added to said list. Again, goodseatsstillavailable.com. You're just going to find all of the old episodes and all the ones to come. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to us, what the hell are you waiting for, friends? Wherever you get podcasts, just click on the subscribe link or follow link, whatever it's called these days, and please do so. And of course, please rate and review us in wherever form you can do, whether that's on Apple Podcasts or anywhere, frankly, ratings and reviews are garnered. We, of course, appreciate that. And of course, that helps lots of extra people, maybe like you, maybe not like you, discover the show and subscribe and follow themselves. So we appreciate you doing that too. That's the least you can do, since we don't charge you nothing for this here little show. So that would certainly help float our boat and then some. We appreciate that. And of course, we could not do this show without the great Herculean efforts of the one, the great Dr. Jerry Payne. Jerry Payne, Audio Excellence. Thank you, kind sir, for all the knob twiddling this week. And thanks to you all for listening thus far. And take care until next week. Enjoy the continued college hoops action, and hopefully a little spring training is finally getting you going too, and all kinds of great stuff from sports coming back to life. Let's hope. Stay safe until then, okay, friends? We'll see you next week. Take care, and ciao.
Hey, we got ourselves a swinging crowd here tonight. That's wonderful. Nice to have all of you folks here at the second show at the Sands Hotel. We didn't intend to swing a little bit and wail a little bit. Hey, hello there. We got a stranger in our midst. Welcome to our club. I'm so glad you came. I hope you like what we're going to do for you. We'd like to tell you about our favorite town, Morty. It's the 8th wonder of the world, the 9th and 10th as well. That fabulous town called Hollywood, where my favorite people dwell. Now some folks can knock it and holler, take it away, but every time they knock it, you're gonna hear me say, hooray for Hollywood, that screwy ballyhooey Hollywood, where any office boy or young mechanic can be a panic, and just a good-looking tan, and any barmaid can be a star maid if she acquires a healthy tan. Hooray for Hollywood, where you're stupendous if you're even good, where every picture is a super duper, and Gary Cooper says, yup, and is still understood. New York, take it away, give me L.A. Hooray for Hollywood! Let's take a stroll down any street, let's head for Sunset and Vine. You never know what stars you meet at noon, but the stars shine. This bus is leaving, we're ready to go, let's go. Now here is a gent that I think everybody here ought to know. Hooray for Jimmy Cag. I make these gestures so my pants won't drag. I make these gestures. That was Jim Williams. What movie star could tell that? Al Capone. You're just a phony. And then do George M. Cohan. Oh, give him a hand. Oh, that Marlon Brando. That very famous method acting man. Marlon Brando. Oh, Stella. When Marlon Brando speaks, a simple line can take like, you know what I mean, like weeks and weeks and weeks. But anything that Marlon Brando can do, can Cary Grant do? You must have rocks in your hood. He's gallivantic. He's Cary Grantic. He's Mr. Hollywood. 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 Hold it. Leave us not forget who's headlining here. I don't care if you're a girl or not. Who ever heard of a girl trumpet player anyway? That's ridiculous. What kind of lipstick do you use? Wow! In case you've just tuned in, I'll make this announcement large. The singers now rule Hollywood, practically in charge. They're acting up a storm, and they just sing now and then. So with your kind permission, a few of the singing men. My life's a swinging thing. From dusk to dawn, it's ring-a-ding-ding-ding. Right next to Frankie Boy, you'll find old Dino, a bass de vino. On Dino looks good. Oh, holy mackerel, sapphire, let my spleen here a minute there. If you're a quibbler, I'll throw in Hitler. Perhaps your path is a way of Mathers. Tony Bennett takes just a minute. Did some Arabian Astrofabian get out of here? Marty Stevens, off